page 244. Escaping to the Western partisans, to the resistance forces, only postponed your full reckoning with the military tribunal. Also, it made you still more dangerous. You could have acquired a very harmful spirit through living freely among Europeans, and if you had not been afraid to escape and continue to fight, it meant that you were a determined person, and that's doubly dangerous in the motherland. Did you survive POW camp at the expense of your compatriots and comrades? Did you become a member of the camp politi, or a commandant, a helper of the Germans, and of death? Stalinist law did not punish you any more severely than if you had operated with the resistance forces. It was the same article of the code and the same term, and one could only guess why, too. Such a person was less dangerous, but the inert law that is inexplicably implanted in us forbade this path to all except the dregs. In addition to those four possibilities, either impossible or unacceptable, there was a fifth: to wait for German recruiters to see what they would summon you to. Sometimes, fortunately, representatives came from German rural districts to select hired men for their farms. Sometimes they came from corporations and picked out engineers and mechanics. According to the supreme Stalinist imperative, you should have rejected that too. You should have concealed the fact that you were an engineer. You should have concealed the fact that you were a skilled worker. As an industrial designer or electrician, you could have preserved your patriotic purity only if you had stayed in a POW camp to dig in the earth, to rot, to pick through the garbage heap. In that case, for pure treason to the motherland, you could count on getting your head raised high in pride, 10 years in prison and 5 more muzzled. Whereas for treason to the motherland, aggravated by working for the enemy, especially in one's own profession, you got, with a bowed head, the same 10 years in prison and 5 more muzzled. And that was a jeweler's precision of a behemoth, Stalin's trademark. Now and then the recruiters turned up who were quite a different stripe. Russians, usually recent communist political commissars. White Guards didn't accept that type of employment. These recruiters scheduled a meeting in the camp. Condemned the Soviet regime and appealed to prisoners to enlist in spy schools or in Vlasov units. People who have never starved as our war prisoners did, who have never gnawed on bats that happened to fly into the barracks, who have never had to boil the soles of old shoes, will never understand the irresistible material force exerted by any kind of appeal, any kind of argument whatever. If behind it, on the other side of the camp gates, smoke rises from a field kitchen, and if everyone who signs up is fed a belly full of kasha right then and there, if only once, just once more before I die. And hovering over the steaming kasha and the inducements of the recruiter was the apparition of freedom in real life, wherever it might call, to the Vlasov battalions, to the Cossack regiments of Krasnov, to the labor battalions pouring cement in the future Atlantic wall, to the fjords of Norway, to the sands of Libya, to the Hiwi units, Hilps village, volunteers in the German Wehrmacht, there being 12 Hiwi men in each German company, and then finally to the village police who pursued and caught partisans, many of whom the motherland would also renounce, wherever it might call, any place at all, at least to anything, so as not to stay there and die like abandoned cattle. We ourselves released from every obligation not merely to his motherland, but to all of humanity, the human being whom he drove to gnawing on bats. And those of our boys who agreed to become half-baked spies still had not drawn any drastic conclusions from their abandoned state. They were still, in fact, acting very patriotically. They saw this course as the least difficult means of getting out of POW camp. Almost to a man, they decided that as soon as the Germans sent them across to the Soviet side, they would turn themselves in to the authorities, turn in their equipment and instructions, and join their own benign command in laughing at the stupid Germans. They would then put on their Red Army uniforms and return to bravely fight in their units. And tell me, who, speaking in human terms, could have expected anything else? How could it have been any other way? These were straightforward, sincere men. I saw many of them. They had honest, round faces and spoke a very attractive Vyatka or Vladimir accent. They boldly joined up as spies, even though they'd had only 4 or 5 grades of rural school and were not even competent to cope with a map and compass. It appears that they picked the only way out they could, and one would suppose that the whole thing was an expensive and stupid game on the part of the German command. But no, Hitler played in rhythm and in tune with his brother dictator. Spy mania was one of the fundamental aspects of Stalin's insanity. It seemed to Stalin that the country was swarming with spies. All the Chinese who lived in the Soviet Far East were convicted as spies. Article 58.6, and were taken to the northern camps where they perished. The same fate had awaited Chinese participants in the Soviet Civil War if they hadn't cleared out in time. Several 100,000 Koreans were exiled to Kazakhstan, all similarly accused of spying. All Soviet citizens who at one time or another had lived abroad, but one time or another had hung around in tourist hotels, who at one time or another happened to be photographed next to a foreigner, or who had themselves photographed a city building, the Golden Gate in Vladimir, were accused of the same crime. Those who stayed too long at railroad tracks, at a highway bridge, at a factory chimney were similarly charged. All the numerous foreign communists stranded in the Soviet Union, all the big and little Comintern officials and employees, one after another, without any individual distinctions, were charged first of all with espionage, and the Latvian riflemen whose bayonets were the most reliable in the first 15 years of the revolution were also accused of espionage when they were arrested to a man in 1937. Stalin seemed somehow to have twisted around and maximized the famous declaration of the coquette Catherine the Great. He would rather that 999 innocent men should rot than miss one genuine spy. Given all this, how could one believe and trust Russian soldiers who had really been in the hands of the German intelligence service? And how it eased the burden for the MGB executioners when thousands of soldiers pouring in from Europe did not even try to conceal that they had voluntarily enlisted as spies. What an astonishing confirmation of the predictions of the wisest of the wise. Come on, keep coming, you silly fools. The article and the retribution have long since been waiting for you. But it is appropriate to ask one more thing. There were still prisoners of war who did not accept recruiting offers, who never worked for the Germans at their profession or trade, and who were not camp police, who spent the whole war in POW camps without sticking their noses outside, and who, in spite of everything, did not die, however unlikely this was. For example, they made cigarette lighters out of scrap metal, like the electrical engineers Nikolai Andreevich Semyonov and Fyodor Fyodorovich Karpov. and in that way managed to get enough to eat. And did the motherland forgive them for surrendering? No, it did not forgive them. I met both Semyonov and Karpov at the Buturki after they had already received their lawful sentence. And what was it? The alert reader already knows. 10 years of imprisonment and 5 muzzled. As brilliant engineers, they had rejected German offers to work in their profession. In 1941, Junior Lieutenant Semyonov had gone to the front as a volunteer. In 1942, he still didn't have a revolver. Instead, he had an empty holster, and the interrogator could not understand why he hadn't shot himself with his holster. He had escaped from captivity 3 times, and in 1945, after he had been liberated from a concentration camp, seated atop a tank as a member of the penalty unit of tank-borne infantry, he took part in the capture of Berlin and received the Order of the Red Star. Yet, after all that, he was finally imprisoned and sentenced. All of this mirrored our nemesis. Very few of the war prisoners returned across the Soviet border as free men, and if one happened to get through by accident because of the prevailing chaos, he was seized out later on, even as late as 1946 or 1947. Some were arrested at assembly points in Germany. Others weren't arrested openly right away, but were transported from the border in freight cars under convoy to one of the numerous identification and screening camps, PFLs, scattered through the country. These camps differed in no way from the common-run corrective labor camps, ITLs, except that their prisoners had not yet been sentenced, but would be sentenced there. All these PFLs were also attached to some kind of factory or mine or construction project, and the former POWs looking out on the motherland, newly restored to them through the same barbed wire through which they had seen Germany, could begin to work from their first day on a 10-hour workday. Those under suspicion were questioned during their arrest periods in the evenings and at night. There were large numbers of security officers and interrogators in the PFLs for this purpose. As always, the interrogation begins with the hypothesis that you are obviously guilty, and you, without going outside the barbed wire, had to prove that you were not guilty. Your only available means to this end was to rely on the witnesses who were exactly the same kind of POWs as you. Obviously, they might not have turned up in your own PFL, might in fact be at the other end of the country. In that case, the security officers of, say, Kemerovo would send off inquiries to the security officers of the Solikamsk, who would question the witnesses and send back their answers along with new inquiries about you and yourself. About you yourself would be questioned as a witness in some other case. True, it might take a year or two before your fate was resolved, but after all, the motherland was losing nothing in the process. You were out mining coal every day, and if one of your witnesses gave the wrong sort of testimony about you, or if none of your witnesses was alive, you had only yourself to blame. You were sure to be entered in the documents as a traitor to the motherland, and the visiting military court would rubber stamp your tenor. And if, despite all their twisting things about, it appeared that you really hadn't worked for the Germans, and if, and this was the main point, you had not had the chance to see the Americas and English with your own eyes, to have been liberated from captivity by them, and instead by us, and was a gravely aggravating circumstance, and the security officers would decide the degree of isolation in which you were to be held. Certain people were ordered to change their place of residence, which always breaks a person's ties with his environment and makes him more vulnerable. Others were valiantly offered to change to go to work in the VLK, the militarized guard service. In that situation, while nominally remaining free, a man lost all his personal freedom and was sent off to some isolated area. There was a third category after a handshake. Some were humanely permitted to return home, although even without aggravating circumstances, they deserved to be shot for having surrendered. The people in this category celebrated prematurely. Even before the former prisoner arrived home, his case had reached his home district through the secret channels of state security. These people remained eternally outsiders, and with the first of mass arrests, like those in 1948-49, they were immediately arrested for hostile propaganda or some other reason. I was imprisoned with people in that category too. Oh, if I had only known. I was a refrain in the prison cells that spring. If I had only known that this was how I'd be graded, that they would deceive me so, that this would be my fate, would I really have returned to my motherland? Not for anything. I would have made my way to Switzerland, to France. I would have gone across the sea, across the ocean, across 3 oceans. But the more thoughtful prisoners corrected them. They had made their mistake earlier. They were stupid to have dashed off to the front lines in 1941. It takes a fool to rush off to war. Right from the start, they should have gotten themselves set up in the rear, somewhere quiet. Those who did are heroes now, and it would have been an even surer thing just to desert. Almost certainly one's skin would be whole. They didn't get 10 years either, but 8 or 7, and they weren't excluded from any of the cushy jobs in camp. After all, a deserter was not regarded as an enemy or a traitor or a political prisoner. He was considered not a hostile factor, but a friendly one, a non-political offender, so to speak. That point of view aroused passionate argument and objections. Deserter had to spend all those years rotting in prison, and they would have not be forgiven. But there would soon be an amnesty for everyone else. They would all be released. At that time, the principal advantage of being a deserter was still unknown. Those who had gotten in via 5810, snatched from their apartments or from the Red Army, often envied the rest. What the hell? For the very same money, in other words, for the same 10-year sentence, they could have seen so many interesting things, like those other fellows who had been just about everywhere. And here we are, about to croak in camp without ever having seen anything beyond our own stinking stares. Incidentally, those who were in on Article 5810 could hardly conceal their triumphant presentiment that they would be the first to be amnestied. Ones who didn't sigh, oh, if I had only known, because they knew very well what they were doing. And the only ones who did not expect any mercy and did not expect an amnesty were the Vlasov men. I'll take a break there. Thank you.